how do Christians deal with some of the hardest arguments against Christianity? We're going to take a look at one of those examples today when we look at father and son Christian apologist duo, Cliffe and Stuart engaging with famous atheist Alex O'Connor.
Do you think that this grace, this omnipotence, this love and charity of the Old Testament God is expressed in the instances where he commands the complete obliteration of entire nations of people, including the women and the children, and even the animals, at multiple points throughout the history of the Israelites trying to conquer their holy land, which is promised to them by God, such that if anybody is already living there, they're driven out, and if they refuse to leave, they're chased out and they're killed, and then they come back and they kill the women and the children. Do you think that this is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
Now, before we hear their response, it's almost like a boxer winding up slowly, a big right hand, and cocking it back and just unloading. Like, he took like a whole minute there, Alex O'Connor, to lay out that question, to add layers to it. And it's important that we think about that before the question is answered. Obviously, it'll be interesting to hear what they say in response, but Alex definitely teed that one up there. Let's see what they say.
No. Instead, I think we've got to read very carefully.
Ooh, okay, hold on. The reason I'm pausing it so quickly because it could be construed, right? The way Alex ended that question, I'm not saying this is what the father Cliffe did here, but it could be construed as if he's saying the God of the Old Testament is not the same as the God of the New Testament. Because if you think back, we're going to go back definitely to hear that again. Because if you think back to how Alex finished answering that question, is the grace and love from God different? Is it the same? And he answered by saying no. Obviously, we have to give him grace and just assume that, maybe it was a long question, and at the start, the question wasn't exactly the same as how Alex ended. So thinking about the whole question in its totality, that may cause a bit of nuance there, but let's definitely go back a couple of seconds and hear him answer that again.
This is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
Is this the same gracious, loving God who's issuing those commands? Obviously, as a Christian, just so this is said and doesn't go without saying, every Christian has to be able to affirm that the same God is in the Old Testament and the New Testament, just categorically. So if he was saying that no, it's a different God, and obviously that's problematic. I don't think he's saying that. I would put that down to the long question and it being a bit drawn out, and him saying that for that reason. But let's go back one more time and we'll let it flow.
That promised to them by God, such that if anybody is already living there, they're driven out, and if they refuse to leave, they're chased out and they're killed, and then they come back and they kill the women and the children. Do you think that this is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
No. Instead, I think we've got to read very carefully.
True.
First point, do I allow God to judge? In my culture, that's unacceptable. And yet the Bible insists God does have the right to judge. Second point, is exaggeration being used? Is hyperbole being used in a lot of those passages? Yes, it is. Because clearly, obviously, many of those people who were supposedly all wiped out appear in the next book. So you know that they weren't all wiped out. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, you look at the archaeological evidence for Jericho and Ai, and you begin to realize those were probably smaller fortresses. Yes, Rahab was in there as a prostitute, but those were not just families and women and children. Those were fortresses that were protecting the families that lived out in the countryside around them.
All right, so before he keeps going, right, he's started pretty well. When we tackle these sort of difficult passages in the Old Testament, there's normally two lines of thought that go through this, especially in the scholarly realm. Popular books on the subject, like from Dr. Paul Copan, Is God a Moral Monster, really drives home this point about there's exaggerated language. And that's true. When you read through the passages, like Cliff said, there's people who are mentioned being wiped out, but then they're mentioned in the next book. So obviously we know that to a certain degree there's hyperbolic language. When we think about the first point he made, which I think is so significant, and especially the way he framed it, he did it so well. He says, look, he's from a culture where making judgments, ruling, like having a sovereign king make decisions that are final decisions is not something his culture is accustomed to, which is obviously true. He lives in America, he lives in a democratic society, right? Where there's no one person above everybody who says this is what goes. But he says, well, what the Bible says, God is presented as the king. He's not voted in as an elected official. God is the official. He's the king. He makes the rules. He decides what goes, what doesn't go. And when we think about it from that framework, we always have to remember as Christians, it's not always the most emotionally palatable. It doesn't always deal with our natural emotions that, you know what, how could God do this? How could this happen in the Bible, etc. But logically, fundamentally, this is what we see all the way throughout the Bible, that God is reigning supreme and he makes the rules. We may not always like it. We may not always understand it. It may not always allow us to feel good, but it's the truth which is laid out in the Bible. So far, apart from that misunderstanding at the start, which more clarity would obviously help this situation, I think it started very well.
Next point is, I think that there is not the emphasis on individualism in the Old Testament that we have in our culture.
Yep.
And yet, the more we struggle through children of alcoholics and realize that there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations. And I think the Old Testament does present a picture that we are more interconnected than we as American individualists would like to admit.
Okay.
And when God judges a people group, yes, some innocent people are swept along in the judgment. And that bugs me. I don't like that. And yet, that is part of, I think, what the Bible is talking about when it says we're created in the image of God, meaning that we do have free will, which means there are consequences to my decisions that affect my children.
True. And just to go back to the third point he made in the first round, where he was speaking about places like Jericho, places in the Promised Land where it wasn't like built up cities. It wasn't where loads of the population were living. And that's true. When you look at the archaeology, when you read scholarly books on it, it didn't seem like Jericho was this place with loads and loads and loads of people there. But although that is true, it doesn't necessarily deal with the problem. At best, when we think about it from that perspective, it's saying, well, loads of people didn't die. A smaller segment of people died. Now, is less people dying better? Yes. But if that smaller group of people still involves certain people, etc., wouldn't it still be a problem? And that's what I believe, one of the things anyway, Alex is driving home or trying to get to in this segment. Now, he made another good point here about, you know what, the world we live in today is very individualized. It's really all about the individual, me. And I'm not even saying that necessarily in a negative light per se, but clearly in the Bible, God is interested in something different. And this goes back to what we was talking about before about the whole democracy versus sovereignty, democracy versus monarchy. God is interested in the people under him to be part of a unit. You go into the Bible in the New Testament, for example, it talks about 1 Corinthians chapter 12, it talks about the body of Christ, a unit of people. It's not about individuals. We are all made in God's image, and because when we become aware of being made in God's image, it now should drive us all together to do things collectively. So that's a good point. When you think about it from that perspective, he's made that point because it shows, as he went on to say, if everybody's connected, all decisions which affect one person affect the next person. And we know this just intuitively in so many different ways. But one of the examples that I think about a lot of the time is when you have a alcoholic parent, for example, and they pass those negative traits down to the child. We obviously don't like those situations, but they're real situations. That's just an example to help us understand how one person and one person's actions or decisions can have serious, significant ramifications on those that are coming after, even though they have done nothing wrong. Those are situations which help us understand sometimes how something like what's happening to the Canaanites or other nations in the Bible, where they're being wiped out and their descendants who may have not done anything are being wiped out or being involved in that judgment. That is obviously something to consider. And just before we continue, it's important to identify that these sorts of things happen to the Israelites as well. So we can't look at this as, you know what, this is God working in one way against certain people, but reserving his chosen people, for example, from going down that route as well. It happens to both people as well. A lot of the stuff we do on the channel is typically me just engaging with an argument against Christianity. This is a great way to look at Christians handling themselves well and defending the Bible or defending Christianity well without necessarily compromising and articulating themselves well as well, which is great.
That affect my grandchildren. We're more interconnected than we would like to admit. So no, those children are not being punished for anything they did wrong, but yes, they're born into a cursed, messed up world, and there are consequences to that. I mean, I benefited from going to Davidson College, and a lot of people sacrificed to put Davidson together. You benefited from going to Oxford University, and there are a lot of people who have over many years given sacrificially to build that. So there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations of our decisions. And also,
and just before he continues, I'll say one more point here. What he's doing there is it's intuitive. He's not only talking about, he talked about it from both sides. There's negative ramifications that go down, but there's also positive results that go down as well. He talks about the college he went to, the school that Alex went to as well. We intuitively know this, and the more we think about this, the more it can help us understand how this stuff works.
So the Bible never says that those children and all those people go to eternity separate from God. I'm convinced that we will see those children in heaven.
Yeah, and most Christians, for the record, probably agree with that as well. Any scenario where there's a child or someone who we would deem as like innocent, not committing that sin that is getting judged, for example, they would typically be looked at as someone who's going to heaven. Most Christians would agree with that as well. Not all, but a lot of them.
If they were killed before an age of accountability. So the justice of God will ultimately triumph.
Yeah.
But do I have problems with the text? Yes, of course I have problems with the text. I don't understand it exactly. I don't understand what God is doing exactly there, why he says that kind of thing. But I'm also convinced that hyperbole is being used. And I think that's a very important thing. For instance, when I was in high school, we used to say, we're going to kill the opposing team that we're going to play that weekend. Not meaning we're literally going to kill them. And the whole idea of, in the Hebrew herem, H-E-R-E-M, of clearing out these people from the promised land. The whole idea that God had given them over 400 years to repent, and they had chosen not to, and now God clears them out. You know, I think it's a complex issue, more complex than the person would allow it to be, who just says, I just can't believe that God would do something like that. Like, well,
obviously, and it's good the way he ended there, because when we think about a topic like this, immediately I think to the new atheists, and that's exactly what they do. How could a loving God do this, etc.? And it's important we think about from that sort of framework, because so often in the day and age we live in, Christians, apologists have had to deal with the new atheists who are trying to blast away at the Bible and say, how could a loving God do this? And typically in those scenarios, we would just look back and say, well, what moral standard are you using to judge us? Now, that works very well. But then at the same time, the reason I like an example like what we're talking about today is because there is a time when Christians have to defend, have to explain and analyze what things are happening in the Bible without internally, basically. We call it an internal critique. We look into the Bible, and based on what's happening in the Bible, how do we make sense of all of this stuff? Now, one of the things he said previously, which I think was really interesting, he says, you know what, look, these things are mentioned in the Bible. He doesn't necessarily like them or feel good about them. And I just want to add some nuance there, because obviously he's already said that God is the king. God in the Bible rules. He makes the decisions. He is the all-wise one. So there's obviously a level of us as believers having to and follow through and adhere to what he's saying. But then at the same time, obviously, we're humans. We have emotions, we think, etc. We live in a fallen world. We're not always going to understand fully everything God is doing. The Bible talks about in Isaiah 55, God's ways, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts and our ways. So there's going to be times when God may do stuff or say stuff which we're not going to understand. And those are the moments where we have to trust and put our faith in God's supremacy, God's eternal wisdom, and say, you know what, Lord, I may not understand this, but I'm going to follow you. There's anyone who's lived a serious amount of time, there's been times we can probably think back to where our parents may have said something to us, or a coach may have said something to us, or a teacher may have said something to us. And at the time, it just seemed like this doesn't make any sense. But as time goes on, we get to a point where we realize, you know what, I see the wisdom now. I think back to examples in my life when my dad would say things to me when I was young, like, you know what, son, this is what's going to happen. And I'd be like, okay, yeah, dad, whatever. And then it's like, I get older. I have children of my own. And I find myself going back to those moments when my dad was teaching me certain things. And I'm like, you know what? He was right. I believe in the end, that's the kind of moment we're all going to have, where we realize, this is what you were trying to show us, because we'll know everything in that way. God will remove the veil, so to speak, and everything will be clear for us to see. Let's keep going.
What kind of instruction had these people been given? You know, like the people of Ai, the people of Jericho, the Canaanites. I mean, did they have Jewish prophets coming to them and saying, you should repent of your ways? Or were they just sort of expected to work it out on their own?
Fascinating question. I'm not sure.
That's a really good question. Excuse me. That's a really good question. And considering he's saying he doesn't know, before he goes on to what he's going to say, what I'll say is this. It's like, archaeology has been mentioned already. Apart from archaeology, which the further we go back in time, typically is going to be harder to discover, we can only go based on whatever we find from archaeology or whatever we find in the Bible. Now, when we think about the Bible, they spoke about Jericho, for example, in Joshua chapter 2, Joshua chapter 6. We know, for example, based on what the Bible tells us, and we look at this, the people in Jericho were aware of God. That's based off the testimony of people like Rahab. She testifies that we've heard of what's going on. We know what your God is coming to do, etc. So there was awareness. But even if you go back to something like Genesis, for example, Genesis, you read about a Gentile king, Abimelech. He's the king of the Philistines, and he has a relationship with God. So from the very beginning, is the point I'm trying to make, is we see that God is working something out. We know as we get into the New Testament, it's showing us clearly that this was all about bringing through the Messiah to be the salvation for the world. But even through that special thread, which goes down to Jesus, there are people from different places who have relationship with God, know about God, and are aware of this stuff. So we have to be mindful of that, even though God isn't necessarily making a covenant with all the nations directly. There are things in the Bible which clearly show us that there's some sort of relationship that other people have with God, etc. And we have to just be aware of those subtle clues. But let's hear what the response is.
I do not know. Obviously, they have consciences. We all have consciences.
Yeah.
Good point.
And when you study ethics from around the world, it's amazing that it seems we're all like reading off the same sheet music.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that, like I said, that's a really good point. And that goes to passages like Romans chapter 1, where the case is being made that nobody is without excuse. We often hear from people who are not Christians, what about the person who doesn't believe? That is the prime answer that we get in the Bible. And it kind of goes back to the point I was making about the Gentile king Abimelech, etc. There are people all the way throughout the Bible who are not part of like the main group, the main characters in the Bible, but have access, have a relationship, etc. And God will and can hold everybody accountable in that way through the inner conscience that we have innately.
There's more and more research coming out too on just how bad these people groups really
Sure,
were.
right.
I'm seeing more of this.
Child sacrifice.
Canaanites, yeah, exactly. It just gets worse every year.
Right.
Like how bad is it going to get? And so,
and let me
the second one,
finish.
have you wrestled with this being a really culturally conditioned question.
Oh, absolutely.
In viewers, the Chinese don't struggle with this one.
Yeah.
I've talked to people of other cultures and I've brought it up and been like, that's totally fine that God judges in that kind of way.
It's so much worse because it's not just like culturally relative. Like I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't believe in the existence of objective moral values, right? And so like, what could I possibly be meaning here? But I don't wrestle with it because my job here isn't to say that this is wrong. My job is to say something like what Lincoln said of slavery. If this isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong.
And a couple of good points have been made here. So, but what I'll say first and foremost is now we've got Stuart involved. The son's getting involved, which is good. And he started off by talking about how the wickedness of the Canaanites, and the Bible goes out of its way over and over again, if you can say, to talk about the wickedness. And Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, for example, gives some of the vile and grotesque behavior of these people. Now, nobody is disputing that. I don't even think Alex is disputing that, but it doesn't deal with the real point. Remember I talked about the boxer swinging his arm back. That's not the hook that's coming, right? That's an easy one for us to get under and just to dodge and say, well, those people are evil. And just like we would judge today, there's places in America and other places in the world where there's the death penalty. Just like we would judge those people and it would be understandable. Alex isn't posing that question for those people. If you notice, he's driving home the point about women, young children, and animals, these vulnerable people who are the ones that really pull on the heartstrings, the real emotional pull in the argument. It's not really about the men, so to speak. So I thought that's very important to say. But Stuart the son made a very powerful point here. He said, look, have you thought about this from a cultural perspective, a cultural identity perspective? And he gave an example of Asians. Certain countries in Asia will hear this and it's like, this isn't a problem. And the reason he's doing that is because he's showing that we can't be pigeonholed into our own ideology. We have to open up our mindset, to be honest, and look at other people and be like, okay, cool. Why is it wrong to us, but they may not necessarily see it as wrong, etc. And then you continue to engage. This goes back to the whole point of God is on top. God makes the rules. Once you remove God from the equation, and we're now all looking at these different things, Alex said it himself. He's not making an argument here from his perspective as an atheist that this is wrong. He's just saying, like I was mentioning earlier, this is an internal critique. We are looking at the Bible as Christians, for example, and saying, how do we make sense of this, etc. Now, I guess it's interesting. It's funny to me because Alex did say, look, you know what? I'm not trying to say this is wrong, but then he says, well, as Abraham Lincoln said, if this isn't wrong, what is? So it's like, you can't have it both ways. Either you're trying to say it's wrong, or you're not trying to say it's wrong. And it's like, this is where I'd say the lines get blurry. He's obviously an atheist, and I've praised Alex in the past for being like an atheist who follows it to its logical conclusion. But then from a Christian perspective, it's like, this is where the line's getting blurred, because it's like, okay, you're not making a moral judgment, but you kind of are making a moral judgment. And that isn't, objectively anyway, in atheism, it's in Christianity. And the moment we get into the Christian world, at that point we start thinking to ourselves, again, going back to what I said earlier on, God reigns supreme. God is the one that makes the rules. And that deals with the problem, so to speak. This is what God has determined to be right, and it's right. Without God's signing off on or approval, then how are we saying objectively it is right and it is wrong? That's where the objective morality and the laws and the rules come from.
If there is such a thing as objective morality, I find it very... I mean, look, we just condemned the Canaanites in part for, they were killing children. Well, that's exactly what God ordered the Israelites to do when they came into their nation. And we say, okay, well, these people were sinful, idolatrous, and they should have repented. Well, the same is true of the Israelites. They were sinful. They were idolatrous.
And The way Alex posed that there, I think it's fair, right? He's saying, look, we just talked about how evil the Canaanites are for doing these sorts of things. The Israelites were doing the same. And it's not a one for one in this situation, right? God isn't sending them into the promised land to go and commit bestiality and commit like lewd acts. I'll just put it like that. He's not telling them to do that. They are doing certain things which are similar. But then this again goes back to the crux of the whole conversations between Christians and atheists, or atheists and Christians. Morality, objective morality. Can God see one group of people doing something which he has deemed this is wrong, and command another group of people to do the same act, but it not be wrong? The way I think about this, a good example I like to think about a lot of the time is, imagine you're in a society and a civilian, you see a civilian out on the road and he kills somebody. But then the next day, you see a police officer in the same place kill somebody as well. They've done the same act, but because of the powers that those two people have, we would view them differently. And this is one way I think helps us understand why we could look at the Canaanites, for example, sacrificing their children, killing children, and a potential scenario where God is commanding the Israelites to go into the promised land or go into a land and obliterate everyone, destroy everyone. If we say, okay, hyperbole can deal with the majority of the examples, but there are some examples where it can't. In those scenarios, is God's decree significant enough to say, okay, I can view the Canaanites as that rogue civilian, which God views them as, and I'm going to view these Israelites as police officers or law enforcers who are enacting judgment and justice from headquarters on high. That's the difference.
And yet they had the benefit of having the prophet of God come to them with literal stone tablets telling them what to do. And even then it took them a few tries to get right. The Canaanites didn't have that. Mm-hmm. And yet when the Israelites are sinful, they get a prophet who comes and sets them straight. When the Canaanites are sinful, they get obliterated. They get exterminated. They get chased out.
I wouldn't, just before they go, I don't know what they're going to say, but I wouldn't say it's as simple as that. I mentioned already, right? There's different people from different nations who have awareness and even have a relationship with God, right? So it's not as simple as these people don't know God, these people know God and they've got the benefits, right? Even if you think about Israel, for example, they're in Egypt, they're living as slaves amongst Egypt, and they're devoted to God. They're serving God, etc. And the Egyptians would have seen that. That's one of the reasons why some of the Egyptians left with the Israelites. Not only because the Egyptians were judged by God, but just think about it from that perspective. As time goes on, it seemed like Alex made it look like these Canaanites did wrong, and then that's it. They just blotted out, no prophets, etc. When we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years of God withholding his judgment, withholding his hand and saying, okay, you know what? I'm going to take some time before I judge you. That's a long period in time before they ever did anything. And when I think about this, I'm like, look, if I look at this as Alex asked this before, like, is this the same gracious and loving God we see in the Old Testament? God could have wiped out these groups, Canaanites, 400 years previously. None of these people would ever exist. None of them. All these descendants for 400 years would never exist. But that is a sign of grace and love, that God can say, okay, cool, you guys are doing wicked. I'm going to give you more time. And as those 400 years continue to go on, more and more of these nations are being wicked. But as you go through these nations, there are some people in these groups who are coming out and are serving God. Like example, like Rahab, who's been mentioned previously. So it's not as simple as they had no prophets or anything like that. God gave them time. And there's clearly some sort of interaction that God has with all of the people in mankind, where they're able to have a relationship with him as well.
The same way the Israelites were At first the hands of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians.
True, but
And that's a good point, right? Going back to the point I made earlier about this isn't some sort of favoritism sort of thing. The Israelites, as God says in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, don't think that it's because you are special that I'm bringing you into the land. It's because these nations are wicked. You do the same stuff and the same thing is going to happen to you. You will be wiped out. And like Cliff has mentioned there, the Assyrians and the Babylonians did exactly that.
It was wrong for the Assyrians to do that. It was wrong for the Babylonians to do that.
And this is where we would disagree. It wasn't wrong.
Yeah, but the Old Testament insists that that was part of God's judgment on the Israelites for them doing.
Yeah, exactly. So when I'm saying it's wrong, God is saying, you've broken my laws, you've broken my covenants, and you should know better. So the same way, when you left Egypt and 40 years later you went into the promised land and exacted judgment, this same sort of judgment is going to be on you as well.
The child sacrifice, temple prostitution, idolatry. God, so it's God's, it gets back to, does God have the right to judge? Yes, he judged the Canaanites, but then remember, a few hundred years later, he judged the Jews, first at the hands of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians.
And that's the pivotal question. That's the pivotal thing we have to always come back to. Does God have the right to rule? Does God have the right to judge? If God has the right to rule, if God has the right to judge, then it explains everything in this situation. And as we read through the Bible, you can clearly see that God is drawing people to him. God wants people to live righteously. He wants them to live lovingly. And if they don't do that, just like in any serious place in life, in any area of life, we have rules, we have checks and balances, we have disciplines for things or for people who are deviating from the right path.
I wanted to talk about the hyperbole thing, right? Because maybe we're not talking about killing everybody. Maybe
we're obviously not, because they were occur in the next book.
But okay, so for example, in the destruction of Ai, 12,000 people fell that day. All the people of Ai. That's what's said in the book of Joshua. Now, maybe all the people of Ai is like an exaggeration, but 12,000 people is pretty specific. It'd be a weird thing to be doing as hyperbole, right? We have a number of people, 12,000 people. We know it's men, we know it's women, we know it's children are slaughtered. We know that that's not hyperbole. We know that thousands of men were killed. We know that I should quote, I don't want to get this wrong. Perhaps we should look at the text. Yeah, so in Joshua chapter 8, when Israel had finished killing all of the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all of the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 people fell that day. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. So we know that women are being killed, non-combatants are being killed. We know that there are thousands of them. We also know that there were people who had left. They'd run into the wilderness. They were out of the promised land, but the Israelites chased after them and then killed them in the wilderness. And it says all of them were put to the sword. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Maybe that some of them ran away. Maybe all of the ones that they captured were put to the sword, but some of them managed to actually run away, and those are the people who show up in the next chapter. But it's only because, for want of trying, that they managed to survive. But maybe it is just hyperbole. But we know that 12,000 people were killed. We know that the Israelites then turned around after killing the fleeing combatants, came back into the city and killed who's left. Well, who's left? The women, the children, the disabled. So even if there's some hyperbole being involved here in terms of the complete destruction, maybe it's not a genocide, but it certainly still seems to be the kind of military practice which, if done today, would see condemnation and a lot more from the United Nations. In 1 Samuel,
this is why I said earlier, we can use the hyperbolic argument, and it can handle many passages, but it doesn't cover every single passage. And even if I wouldn't necessarily say I agree with Alex's full interpretation of the passage he's talking about, but there are clearly passages where it's not hyperbolic and God is saying blot everybody out. Now, you don't hear this very much anywhere in the scholarly arena. One of the popular arguments, I'd say, which people deal with as to why God is very aggressive with men, women, children, etc., animals, is because of the whole argument of what we call today the Nephilim. I'm not going to jump into deep analysis of that in this video, but that would be a viable way to understand why God is saying wipe out everybody. You can study that out in your own time in the future.
There's this, again, I should read the text to be sure, and I do have it written down. This is the destruction of the Amalekites. God issues the command now, go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to the death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Of course, this can't be literal, because it's not just the camels and sheep and the donkeys. Oh, but you can leave the, you can leave the pigs or whatever. Sure, this is sort of like slightly rhetorical language, but it's very clear. Like, leave alive nothing that breathes. Kill the men, kill the women, kill the animals, kill the cattle. And in fact, when Saul decides at the end of the battle to keep alive the king, take him as a hostage, and also keeps alive some of the animals to sacrifice, to slaughter as a sacrifice to God, what happens? He's condemned. And God says, the scripture says, that God regretted that he made Saul king. He regretted that he made Saul king because he didn't follow his command. What command didn't he follow? That after wiping out the Amalekites, he refused to also kill all of the animals, and he kept the king alive as a hostage. And that was enough for God to say, I regret that I ever made Saul king because he didn't follow my commands. And so I understand that there may be some hyperbole involved here, but in the case where Saul is punished, specifically not for killing all of the animals, it's hard for me to imagine how much scope there is for hyperbole here in terms of undermining the criticism that we are talking about the slaughter of innocent people here.
Mm-hmm. It shows the importance and just how clear God wants to make it that Israelites are to be set apart and a holy people. And so whether it's an ant or a soldier all the way down, we see with sinful human beings just how easy it is for them to slip into prostitution, but more so getting a harem, more so whatever this might be, and slip into assimilation of some sort with other civilizations. And so God has to act in this kind of way, however extreme it seems, to show them, whether it's Achan later on in Acts chapter 5, for example, the temptation and how quick this happens. It's such a slippery slope where God is saying, here's the line, and we have to do away with any level of temptation. You talked about temptation earlier. We know how easy is it to fall prey to temptation. This is another thing with university students and older people. All they want to talk about is temptation and how easy it is to fall typically into porn addiction and these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Well, very similar to what's going on there in terms of you have to kill off any and everything that's going to cause temptation because you are God's holy chosen people. Okay, whoa, isn't that really ethnocentric? Isn't that a big issue still? I don't see that in my mind because I believe what's going on in the Old Testament with the Israelite people is probably the most exclusive inclusivity you could ever imagine, which is God is this God of the Israelites who are holy people who are not supposed to mix at all, even with an animal, with people of another civilization. So that's how exclusive they are, but how inclusive in the sense of they're a light to all the nations. And eventually it's going to come through the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who is literally Samaritan, child, woman, all the oppressed people groups, and Zacchaeus, like we talked about earlier, Luke chapter 19, and the sycamore tree, who attached to the vector, probably very wealthy. So it's a light to all nations, and that separateness, that word holy and righteousness, he takes so seriously and so extreme. I wish it wasn't that extreme, but it stacks up to me. It also makes sense seeing how powerful human temptation really is and how hard it is to restrain yourself.
And that is true on so many different levels. Stuart's going through the big, broad picture we see from scripture. It can be missed. And the more familiar you become with the Bible as a whole, it becomes clearer. It's like looking in at a glass and it's foggy. Or let's even say go deeper than that. You're looking at a glass and it's foggy, but there's snow on it as well. And as you wipe away the snow, you peel it all back, and then you wipe away the fog, you can then see clearly the window and you can see through the window. This is what happens the more you read through the Bible and the more you understand about the Bible. It's easy for us to read the Gospels and look back and realize, okay, wow, everything that is happening here is to showcase on the world stage in a great way that there's this beacon of light, which from the very beginning has been growing to now showcase to the world that everybody should come to me. That's God's message. But I didn't mention this before, but it's come up over and over again. And Alex keeps driving this point home. In other ways, you can simplify it like this. Okay, forget about the men. Let's focus on the women, the children, and the animals. And the point that continues to come up is the fathers raised it, the sons raised it. Is God able to judge? Now, the kind of Christian I am, when I look at the Bible, when I think about this on a broad level, there's things in the Bible which are easy to take, there's other things which are harder to take. And it's like, okay, like, Lord, I don't understand this, I don't fully get this, etc. This doesn't feel good. But okay, Lord, I trust you. The reason I'm saying this is because one of the ways you have to think about certain things in life is, okay, cool. We have to be able to ask the question and answer the question. If God is the king, is he able to take a man's life, a woman's life, a child's life, an animal's life, because he's God? And where we fall, where we end up on that question, determines everything else as to how we look at the Bible. So, and I'm saying that even with passages like this, and the reason I'm saying this is because for some people, they drive home this hyperbolic language all the way to the end. And for others, it's like, okay, there's clearly some hyperbole in the Bible, but there's other parts in the Bible where this doesn't fit properly. And we can't, taking the Bible contextually and without forcing something onto it, we can't use this argument here. This is what Alex is driving home here. We have to be able in those moments to say, let's say, for example, this is what happened. Is God able to do this as God? And the obvious answer is yes. I mentioned previously, it may not feel easy to say all the time, but the obvious answer is yes. And that's where we need to be able to get to and realize, okay, look, you know what? Just like a parent, for example, makes decisions sometimes which we don't like, makes decisions which sometimes maybe even hurt us. Just like governments make decisions sometimes which we don't like or may hurt us. They're in those positions of power. And when we cast that out to the nth degree, right? Exponentially out, God is at the top. And it's like, okay, look, God is there. He makes the rules. We may not always like it. We may not always feel like it makes sense to us, but he's still in that position. And there's a little bit more in this 20-minute segment, but I'm going to wrap it up there. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you on the next one. God bless.